Hawk family with their friend. It was a big jungle where the Hawk family lived. The Hawk family consisted of Mr. Hawk, Mrs. Hawk, and their 3 little babies. Deep inside the jungle, Lion lived there. His name is Mr. Leo. He was mighty big and looked very ferocious. Near the tree where the Hawks lived there was a big lake. Just near the lake there also lived Mr. Kingfisher. And deep down in the lake lived Torque the turtle. One day, while Mrs. Hawk was feeding some soft worms to her babies, she said to her husband,
"Dear, we must find some friends. It is so lonely here all along in the tree."
Mr. Hawk, who was busy looking new food, he said,
"With whom shall I make friends? Why, there is the Fisher, who live across the lake. Then there is the lion who lives in the deep forest, and there is the turtle."
So, the next day, Mr. Hawk flew to the den of Leo. Leo welcomed his guest very soon. They became friends. Next, Mr. Hawk met Mr. Kingfisher and Torque, and a bond of a friendship was formed between them. And Mrs. Hawk was very happy. All the friends would meet and dine together. Torque, who was an excellent musician, played the drum while Leo sang song. Mr. Hawk and Mr. Kingfisher would dance to the tune of the fiddle, while Mrs. Hawk and her 3 little babies looked on. One day, 3 hunters came to the forest. They searched the whole day for a game but could find none. When it was evening, the 3 planned to return back home. While trying to find their way, but they lost their way. Finally, they decided to spend the night next to the lake. Now it happened that the 3 hunters decided to rest under the very tree in which the Hawks had their nest. "Let us stay here tonight," they said, "and see what we can find in the morning." So they made beds of leaves for themselves and lay down to sleep. But it was Cartoon-I and the hunters kept shivering last. The hunters got up, gathered dry leaves and twigs and made a fire beneath the tree. Soon thick smoke rose up to the sky and awoke the Hawk family. The babies began to choke with smoke and then started twittering aloud. Mr. and Mrs. Hawk tried to silence their babies, knowing that if the hunters came to know of their presence, they might do harm, but it was vain.
Did you hear that?
That was the cry of birds.
They are young ones in that nest. Will fetch a good price in the market.
And so the hunters put more wood on the fire. And the fire blazed up. The fire became bigger and bigger until it almost touched the hawk's nest. The little hawk began to cry louder out of fear. Seeing the danger, Mrs. Hawk said to her husband,
"We must ask our friends to save us. Go to Mr. Kingfisher and tell him what danger we are in."
"Oh, that right."
Mr. Hawk immediately flew with all speed to Mrs. Kingfisher's nest and told her about the trouble. Fear not wasting another moment, the 2 friends flew back towards the hawk's nest, while Mr. Hawk flew down to the nest to comfort his children. Mr. Kingfisher flew to the lake. Now during the time that Mr. Hawk was away, one of hunters had climbed up the tree. Just as the hunter neared the nest, Mr. Kingfisher dived into the lake and flapped his wings. As a result, the water from the lake splattered and doused at the fire. Down came the hunter from the tree and the 3 men made another fire. This time the fire was even bigger. But once more Mr. Kingfisher put it out, splashing water from the lake. Not to be outdone, the hunters made yet another fire. Mrs. Hawk noticed this and said to her husband,
"Mrs. Kingfisher would be tired soon if these wicked men keep lighting the fire again and again. Go and ask Torque to help."
So Mrs. Hawk asked Mr. Kingfisher to rest while he called on Torque from the bank. Torque the turtle came to the bank. Her rubbed this eyes lazily took a deep yawn and said,
Dear Mr. Hawk, what is the matter? That you come to me at this hour of the night?
Mr. Hawk briefed Torque about the danger. He was in when Torque heard this he extra energy and then dived into the water. Soon Torque came up with a lump of damp clay and went towards the fire. When the hunters were busy looking up at the nest of the hawk, Torque put out the fire with the clay. The hunters saw that the fire was out and they were very surprised, but they lit up the fire immediately. This time when Torque was putting the clay, the hunters saw him. They said,
Why should we bother to get the young hawk? Let us kill this turtle. He will make a fine breakfast for all of us. Hearing this, Torque dived into the water. But the greedy men took off their shirts and prepared to jump into the water to catch Torque. Seeing that Torque was in great trouble, Mr. Hawk flew to Leo and told him the whole story.
Leo the lion said, I will come at once, and the two friends started for the hawks. Near the lake, Leo saw that the men were trying to catch Torque. Immediately Leo let out a loud roar. When the hunters heard the roar, they cried in fear, Now we shall all be killed, and away they ran as fast as they could. Then Mrs. Kingfisher and Torque came up, and the hawks said, You have saved us today. And Leo. Torque and Mrs. Kingfisher smiled.